Sometime in 2023, in a data center on the outskirts of Singapore, racks of Nvidia H100 accelerators spun up a training run commissioned by an artificial intelligence lab in China, thousands of miles away, on chips that were never legally allowed to set foot on Chinese soil under United States export rules. The breach in the embargo did not come from a chip crossing the border. It came from a training run crossing the border instead, riding inside somebody else's data center. From a rule written in 2022 to a workaround that left that rule almost beside the point, this is a story about which half of an export ban was actually doing the work. The rule itself looked airtight on paper. It named the chips, named the buyers, and closed the sale. What it never named was the thing those chips actually produce, which doesn't travel through a port and can't be stopped at one. Here is the chain that runs from that 2022 rule to a Singapore rack quietly doing Beijing's work today. 5 links, each only as solid as the reporting behind it. In October of 2022, and again through 2023, the United States tightened export controls barring the sale of Nvidia's most advanced artificial intelligence accelerators, the A100, the H100, and their successors, to customers in China. This is confirmed. It's documented in successive updates from the United States Bureau of Industry and Security, the agency that writes and enforces these export rules, and the effect followed directly. Chinese firms and labs lost legal, direct access to the chips best suited for training frontier-scale artificial intelligence models. One training job, the kind that needs thousands of top-tier processors running for weeks, simply couldn't be built on a legal supply chain anymore. That's where the chain starts, with a door closed cleanly and on the record. What the rule never touched was the appetite on the other side of that door. Chinese artificial intelligence labs were racing the same scaling curve as everyone else, chasing larger models that need more computation, not less, and a ban on hardware sales does nothing to a demand curve. This second link is confirmed too. It shows up in continued model releases from Chinese labs through 2023 and 2024, in public statements about compute shortages, in the simple fact that nobody in that race slowed down because Washington changed a rule. The rule that mattered here was never really the ban on owning the chips. It was the absence of any rule covering what happens when you don't own them but still get to use them, and that gap is the link the rest of this chain hangs on. With direct purchase and import closed off, Chinese firms turned to a channel the rules hadn't anticipated. They started renting graphics processing capacity by the hour from cloud providers and data centers based outside China, in Singapore, in the Gulf, in other jurisdictions where Nvidia's top chips were sitting legally, deployed, and idle enough to lease out. Multiple technology press reports since 2023 describe exactly this pattern: Chinese customers booking time on offshore racks rather than buying hardware they couldn't import. This link is reported, not confirmed in the way the export rule itself is confirmed. Nobody has published a reliable count of how many of these deals exist, which providers are involved, or what share of Chinese training work now runs this way. But the pattern itself, training and inference jobs commissioned from China and executed on restricted Nvidia silicon that was never sold to, owned by, or shipped into the country, shows up across enough independent accounts to treat as established practice even without a precise number attached to it. Think about what that actually requires and what it doesn't. A chip in a crate needs a customs form, a shipping manifest, a buyer who can be named and sanctioned. A training job has none of that. It's a request sent to a remote machine, computation performed somewhere else, and a result sent back. Compute, unlike a chip in a crate, has no customs form, and treating it as though it did was the original miscalculation underneath everything that followed. Export law has always been written to govern the movement of physical things, a chip on a pallet, a shipment cleared or stopped at a port. It was never written to govern a remote connection to a rack sitting quietly in another country's jurisdiction. Doing work for a customer, the rules say it shouldn't be serving. That's where the expectation turns over. Regulators built a wall around the silicon, watching the border for chips trying to cross it. They never built a roof, because nobody had reason to think the thing that mattered could simply fly over. The shortage of legal hardware inside China did not get solved by hardware finding its way in anyway. It got solved by the workload going out instead, training jobs sent across the same border. The chips were barred from crossing except moving in the opposite direction, riding a network connection instead of a cargo hold. The statute had its eyes on the loading dock. The actual breach showed up on a network cable, and it didn't look like smuggling at all. It looked like a phone call placed to a building 2 countries away. It helps to picture the embargo as a locked warehouse. The lock is real, and it works. Nothing physical leaves through that door. No chip gets carried out under a coat or hidden in a shipment. But the same warehouse has a phone line running into it, and a customer standing on the other side of a border can call in, describe exactly what they need done, and have the goods inside put to work on their behalf without a single object crossing the threshold. The lock did exactly what it was built to do. It just wasn't guarding the part of the building where the value actually left. This is the part of the chain that's argued rather than documented, the fourth link, and it deserves to be marked that way. No single confirmed account proves that offshore rental substitutes for direct chip ownership at the scale of full model training, as opposed to smaller experiments or occasional overflow capacity. The inference follows from the structure of the rules and the reported pattern of offshore rental, and it's a strong inference, but it's still an inference. The workaround did not defeat the export regime outright. It revealed which half of that regime was doing the actual work, and it turned out not to be the half aimed at the hardware itself. Even granting all of that, renting time on a rack in Singapore doesn't do everything ownership would. It trains a model, and that's real, but it doesn't transfer a single chip onto Chinese soil. It doesn't build domestic manufacturing capacity, and it doesn't let the most sensitive or proprietary training runs happen on infrastructure that China actually controls and can secure on its own terms. This fifth link is reported, drawn from continued state investment in domestic semiconductor and accelerator development inside China through 2023, 2024, and into 2025, running in parallel with the reported offshore rental activity rather than replacing it. The workaround narrows the gap on output, on what gets built and trained, while leaving the deeper gap exactly where it was, the question of who owns the leading-edge hardware outright. That's why China's own chip program kept moving regardless of how much offshore renting was happening at the same time. One training job sitting on chips its operator was barred from owning never closes that second gap, no matter how many times the trick gets repeated. The softest part of this whole account is scale. Public reporting describes the pattern of offshore compute access clearly enough, but nobody has put a reliable figure on how much of China's artificial intelligence training now actually runs through racks outside the country, and that absence makes it easy to overstate how much of the underlying shortage this workaround actually closes. It could be a meaningful share of mid-tier training work and a much smaller share of frontier scale work, or the reverse, and the public record doesn't currently settle that question either way. The channel itself isn't fixed in place either. United States and allied regulators have already started scrutinizing offshore cloud access by Chinese customers, which means the very door this chain describes may already be narrower than it was when the first reports of this practice surfaced. What's confirmed is the ban itself and the demand it never managed to kill. What's reported is the rental pattern that grew up around that demand, along with its limits on ownership and domestic capacity. What's inferred is how much actual weight that rental pattern bears in closing China's compute shortfall, and that's the piece still being tested in real time, by regulators tightening rules on one side and by procurement teams finding the next gap on the other. An export ban aimed squarely at a physical object ran into a workload that never had to be physical at all. China couldn't buy the chips it wanted, so for a meaningful slice of its artificial intelligence development, it bought time on them instead, and the hardware never had to cross a border for the computation too. The ban still bites exactly where it was always going to bite, on outright ownership, on building domestic scale, on the training runs sensitive enough that nobody wants them sitting on a rack they don't fully control. But for everything short of that line, the chips Beijing was never sold are still doing Beijing's work, somewhere on a rack it doesn't own, in a country that isn't China, running a job that doesn't show up on any customs form because nothing about it was ever designed to. Washington built a wall around the silicon. It forgot the wall has no roof, and computation can be rented from the other side of a border without the hardware underneath it ever moving an inch. The border held. The compute didn't notice. What happens next will show up in one of two places, and it's worth watching which one comes first. Either regulators close this offshore rental gap the same way they closed the direct export channel back in 2022, or the rental market simply hardens into the new normal route, the thing everyone routes around the next restriction through. Whichever shows up first in the next round of export rules will tell you a great deal about whether anyone has actually learned what this chain just proved, that a wall built for objects can't stop a workload that was never an object in the first place. Subscribe for the next link in this chain, as it's reported.